On the morning of December 26, 1996, the Boulder, Colorado, Police Department received one of the most unusual 911 calls in its history.
911 emergency. Police, upon 15th Street. What's going on there, ma'am? We were kidnapped.
Patsy Ramsey, a former beauty queen and the wife of businessman John Ramsey, frantically reported that her 6-year-old daughter, JonBenét, had been kidnapped. It was just after Christmas. The family's large home on 15th Street, valued at nearly $1.1 million at the time, was decorated with lights and garlands. Everything about the night before had seemed normal. The Ramseys had attended a neighborhood Christmas party, returned home around 9:30 p.m., and gone to bed, preparing for an early morning flight to Michigan. At 5:30 a.m., Patsy went downstairs wearing the same clothes she had worn the night before. On the back staircase, she noticed several pages of a handwritten letter spread out across the steps. It began, "Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction." The note demanded $118,000 in ransom for JonBenét's safe return, a strangely specific amount that matched almost exactly John Ramsey's Christmas bonus from his company, Access Graphics, that year. The note, nearly 400 words long, was written on stationery taken from inside the house and signed Victory, SBC. Its length, tone, and wording were all unusual. It contained movie cliches, erratic punctuation, and several spelling errors. Patsy screamed for her husband, then rushed to JonBenét's room, where she found her bed empty. At 5:52 a.m., she dialed 911. The transcript of the call captures her panic. She reported a kidnapping, begged the operator to hurry, and repeated that her daughter was missing. When she appeared to hang up, the line stayed open briefly. Later audio analysis suggested faint background voices could be heard, possibly John and a child. The Ramseys later stated that their 9-year-old son, Burke, had slept through the entire ordeal. Officer Rick French was the first responder to arrive at 755 15th Street. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the fresh snow outside, and nothing obviously disturbed inside the house. The basement window that John Ramsey claimed to have broken months earlier to gain access was still unlatched, but there was no evidence anyone had entered through it. The officer found the ransom note on the staircase and immediately notified detectives. By 6 a.m., police began securing the home. Despite the note's instruction not to call the police or speak to anyone, the Ramseys contacted several friends and their family pastor. Within hours, multiple people were walking through the house, touching surfaces, cleaning the kitchen, consoling Patsy. This destroyed any chance of preserving an uncontaminated crime scene. Detective Linda Arndt arrived shortly after 8 a.m. She began coordinating the investigation while other officers waited for the expected ransom call. None came. The note had said the kidnappers would call between 8 and 10 a.m. with further instructions, but by mid-morning the house was silent. John Ramsey, meanwhile, began to arrange the ransom money. He later stated that he was prepared to pay immediately, even though the instructions were unclear. By noon, with no contact from the supposed kidnappers, Arndt suggested that John and family friend Fleet White conduct another search of the house to look for anything unusual. At around 1 p.m., John and Fleet went into the basement. Behind a latched white door in a windowless storage area sometimes referred to as the wine cellar, John found his daughter's body. She was lying on the floor, covered with a white blanket. Her hands were bound above her head with a nylon cord, and there was silver duct tape over her mouth. A garrote made from a length of white cord and the broken handle of one of Patsy's paintbrushes was tightly wound around her neck. John picked her up and carried her upstairs, placing her body on the living room floor. Paramedics and police rushed to the scene, but JonBenét was pronounced dead at 1:05 p.m. The act of moving her body, though understandable in the moment, effectively contaminated crucial evidence. The following morning, the Boulder County coroner conducted an autopsy. The official report determined that JonBenét's cause of death was asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. The head injury, a skull fracture nearly 8.5 inches long, had rendered her unconscious, but the strangulation was the final cause of death. The garrote had been twisted with considerable force. The autopsy also recorded abrasions on her neck, back, and legs, and noted signs consistent with possible sexual assault. However, the findings were ambiguous. While there was evidence of vaginal injury, there was no definitive proof of rape. Foreign male DNA was discovered beneath her fingernails and in her underwear. It did not match John, Patsy, or Burke Ramsey, nor did it match any law enforcement database profiles. That DNA would remain a crucial and still unexplained element of the case. The Boulder Police Department faced immediate challenges. The crime scene had been compromised before forensic teams arrived. More than 60 people had entered the home before it was sealed off. Furniture had been moved, the blanket covering JonBenét came from her own bed, and countless fingerprints and fibers had been introduced. Officers also failed to isolate the family for individual interviews that morning, allowing them to potentially coordinate accounts. When the autopsy results were released, the investigation shifted from a kidnapping to a homicide. The ransom note's existence, along with the absence of forced entry, made the situation even stranger. Investigators began to divide into two competing theories. One, that an intruder had broken in and murdered JonBenét, and two, that someone inside the house had staged a kidnapping to cover up a death. The ransom note itself was analyzed by multiple handwriting experts. John Ramsey's handwriting was ruled out completely. Patsy Ramsey's samples showed similarities, letter formations, phrasing, and stylistic quirks, but examiners could not conclusively identify her as the writer. The FBI characterized the note as a carefully contrived attempt to lead investigators astray. The behavior of the Ramseys drew further scrutiny. Patsy's emotional reactions were interpreted differently by every observer. Some saw genuine grief, others saw theatricality. John appeared composed but distant. Within days, the family hired attorneys and a public relations spokesperson. To police, that looked defensive. To the Ramseys, it was a necessary response to an aggressive investigation and unrelenting media coverage. The press quickly turned the tragedy into national spectacle. JonBenét's pageant photos circulated everywhere, often juxtaposed against headlines suggesting dark secrets behind the family's wealth and image. Public opinion split. One side believed in the intruder theory, suggesting a pedophile or burglar had entered through the basement window. The other side believed in the Ramsey theory, that a member of the family, perhaps in an accident, had killed her and staged a kidnapping. Over time, resentment grew within the Boulder Police Department and in the district attorney's office over how the investigation was being handled. In August 1998, Detective Steve Thomas resigned, stating the case had been thoroughly compromised. The grand jury formed to assess the evidence began in September 1998, and by October 1999 the DA announced there was insufficient evidence to indict anyone. In July 2008, a turning point arrived. The Boulder District Attorney's Office announced that advanced DNA testing had excluded all members of the Ramsey family as suspects. A letter formally declared John, Patsy, and Burke not under suspicion in the case. This development reinvigorated the intruder theory and shifted many investigative resources back to searching for an unknown third-party perpetrator. Still, despite decades of effort, some fundamentals remain unresolved. The jury of public opinion remains split, the evidence remains tangled, and the unanswered questions stack higher than ever. Was the ransom note genuine or staged? Did someone outside the home sneak in, commit the crime, and slip out unobserved? Or did something happen inside, and an attempt was made to cover it up? The forensic trail points to an unidentified male. The circumstantial trail continues to point, in many people's minds, back to the house itself. As the investigation entered the 2000s and beyond, the focus shifted heavily onto modern DNA techniques, cold case review teams, and re-examining previously tested items. In the era of genetic genealogy, many believed the case might finally break open. Investigators cataloged thousands of items, scanned hundreds of DNA markers, and reviewed the inconsistencies and missteps of the early hours. The case of JonBenét Ramsey stands as a cautionary tale. The potency of forensic science, the influence of public perception, and the deep consequences of a crime scene badly handled. From the moment news broke that a 6-year-old beauty pageant contestant was found dead in her family home, the story exploded across every channel and every front page. JonBenét's image, her bubbly pageant photos, her crown, her small garnished bike from Christmas, formed the headline. The contrast between her smiling, tiara-worn face and the brutality of her death created almost instant national and international fascination. Within 24 hours of her body being discovered, satellite trucks lined the streets of Boulder, Colorado. News crews streamed in. Every detail, every rumor, every whisper of fact or speculation was broadcast. The ransom note, the broken basement window, the garrote, the blanket, the hijab scenes of the Ramseys' home, all of it became spectacle. Some of the earliest public statements came not from police investigators, but from the Ramseys themselves. On January 1, 1997, John and Patsy Ramsey gave a television interview to CNN from Atlanta. Patsy said, "There is a killer on the loose. If I were a resident of Boulder, I would tell my friends to keep your babies close to you. There's someone out there." The contrast was stark. For the family still reeling from loss, their public plea also made them part of the media spectacle. From that point forward, the media quickly divided the story into two broad narratives. One narrative, the grieving, privileged family in shock, victims of a monstrous intruder. The other, the glamorous pageant lifestyle of a young girl whose death exposed dark possibilities inside the home. These competing narratives strengthened the public's appetite for speculation. In the weeks that followed, every appearance of the Ramseys, every quote, every tear, every lawyer's statement was analyzed and broadcast as evidence. Handwriting experts appeared on talk shows. Documentaries popped up. Books were written. The case became as much about the optics, about what the Ramseys and police looked like, as it was about what actually had happened. The media coverage itself affected the investigation. Officers and prosecutors later admitted they felt under enormous pressure. Critics accused the police of being reactive rather than proactive, of allowing the sensationalism to dominate the story instead of methodically chasing evidence. By summer 1998, the chief of police publicly acknowledged the investigation had been hampered by the media and public relations concerns. Part of the media's focus also centered on JonBenét's pageant involvement. For some viewers, the idea of a 6-year-old in rhinestone and tiara made the story seem surreal, almost storybook. But for others, it raised questions. Why was a child so young in pageants? Was that relevant? The commentary shifted from purely investigative to moral. How had a little girl been placed into such a spotlight? What did that say about her family, her environment? And how did that environment factor into what happened? Television specials followed. In 2000, the network film Getting Away with Murder, the JonBenét Ramsey story, presented dramatized reenactments. In 2016, the CBS documentary miniseries The Case of JonBenét Ramsey aired, examining competing theories and fueling renewed public curiosity. Most recently, in November 2024, the Netflix docuseries Cold Case, Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey debuted, promising to take a fresh look at possible investigative missteps and media influence. The effect of this media storm cannot be understated. It influenced public perception. To many, the Ramseys became prime suspects before charges were ever filed. The district attorney's office repeatedly faced criticism. Some said they were too slow, others said they were too eager to point at the family. The phrase "under an umbrella of suspicion" was used publicly by DA Alex Hunter in 1997 when referring to the Ramseys. The Independent media coverage also shifted how witnesses and evidence were portrayed. Casual remarks became headline news. Police source leaks made the case feel as though it was being tried in public before a court of law. Some investigators left the case, citing frustration not only with the investigation itself, but with the media pressure. For example, Detective Steve Thomas resigned in 1998, writing that the case had been thoroughly compromised. Public obsession carried other consequences. The case entered pop culture. Documentaries, podcasts, talk shows, books, reenactments, all treated the Ramseys both as characters and as suspects. The pageant child killed in her home image became iconic. Some scholars have pointed out how this case exemplified the media's fixation on tragic young white girls and luxury suburban settings, compared to many other murders that receive less attention. At the same time, the enormous media exposure generated leads, but also false ones. Hundreds of tips poured into the Boulder Police Department's tip line. According to the city of Boulder, more than 21,000 tips have been submitted over the years. But the sheer volume, combined with media-fueled theories, made the investigative task even harder. Sorting signal from noise became a major problem. Ultimately, the case's transformation into a media spectacle changed how it was investigated and how the public remembers it. What should have been a painstaking forensic inquiry became, in many eyes, a drama of wealthy parents, a child star, a ransom note, and unanswered questions. As the story of JonBenét Ramsey continues to be retold, one key element endures. Media coverage didn't just report the case. It shaped the case. It reframed the investigation, reopened it to speculation, and kept the mystery alive, and the public watching. As months turned into years, the legal aftermath of JonBenét Ramsey's murder began to unfold. What started as a child murder investigation soon became one of the most scrutinized and legally complex cases in American criminal history. It wasn't only about what happened that night, it was about how justice itself could falter under the pressure of public scrutiny. After the initial investigation, the Boulder District Attorney convened a grand jury in 1998. The purpose was clear: to determine if there was enough evidence to indict anyone for JonBenét's murder. The Ramseys, by this point, had become unwilling celebrities. They appeared on television, published a book defending themselves, and hired high-profile lawyers and private investigators. The grand jury heard testimony from dozens of witnesses, reviewed forensic evidence, and examined the ransom note. But after 13 months, in October 1999, District Attorney Alex Hunter announced that there would be no indictments. "We do not have sufficient evidence," he said, "to warrant filing charges against anyone." That statement was technically true, but not the full story. It wasn't until 2013, more than a decade later, that the public learned the grand jury had, in fact, voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey in 1999 on charges of child abuse resulting in death and accessory to a crime. Hunter had declined to sign those indictments, citing lack of evidence for conviction. This revelation reignited the debate. Had the prosecutor protected the Ramseys, or had he simply acted prudently given the weak forensic case? By then, Patsy Ramsey had already passed away. She died in 2006 after a long battle with ovarian cancer, never charged, never exonerated, always publicly entangled in the case. The years that followed were filled with more controversy than clarity. In 2000, the Ramseys filed multiple defamation suits against media outlets, detectives, and even authors who suggested their guilt. They won or settled several of those cases. The tabloids had painted them as villains, and in civil court, at least, they fought back. In 2003, an independent investigator, Lou Smith, who had once been part of the prosecution team, went public with his belief that the Ramseys were innocent and that an intruder had killed JonBenét. Smith's theory pointed to signs of forced entry through a basement window, unidentified boot marks, and male DNA on JonBenét's clothing. He presented a slideshow of evidence to journalists, showing that the DNA did not match any member of the Ramsey family or anyone in law enforcement. Then, in 2006, came one of the strangest developments in the case. A 41-year-old American schoolteacher named John Mark Carr was arrested in Bangkok, Thailand, after claiming he had been present when JonBenét died. He told authorities that her death had been an accident and that he loved her. For a brief moment, it looked as though the case might finally have a suspect. But Carr's confession unraveled almost immediately. His DNA did not match the profile found on JonBenét's clothing, and many of his claims about the crime were inconsistent with known facts. The Boulder District Attorney's office quickly dismissed him as a false confessor. He was released without charge. Despite Carr's false confession, his arrest demonstrated the public obsession still surrounding the case. Dozens of other individuals over the years would contact police with claims or confessions, each one disproven by DNA. In 2008, A significant milestone came when District Attorney Mary Lacey formally exonerated the entire Ramsey family. She announced that new, advanced DNA testing had conclusively cleared them of involvement. The testing showed that the male DNA under JonBenét's nails and on her underwear came from the same unknown individual, and that it was not from anyone in the Ramsey household. Still, not everyone agreed with the DA's decision. Some investigators argued the DNA could have been contamination from manufacturing or handling of the clothing. Others believed it was a solid lead to an unidentified killer. The case, once again, stood at a crossroads. The evidence suggested an intruder, but no intruder could be found. Over time, the public's trust in the investigation deteriorated. Critics accused Boulder police of bias and incompetence, and the DA's office of political caution. The tension between these agencies became legendary. Former Detective Steve Thomas wrote a book condemning the DA's approach. Others inside law enforcement blamed early missteps, like allowing the family to move around the house before it was sealed, for destroying the possibility of ever getting clear answers. Legal efforts continued into the 2010s. The Ramseys pursued open records requests and pushed for the case to be transferred to more advanced DNA analysis teams. In 2016, the 20-year anniversary of JonBenét's death, the Boulder Police Department announced they had re-examined over 1,500 pieces of evidence and analyzed nearly 200 DNA samples. In 2022, John Ramsey publicly urged the state of Colorado to allow an independent lab, one specializing in genetic genealogy, to reanalyze the DNA evidence using the same techniques that identified the Golden State Killer. He argued that law enforcement had become too cautious, too bureaucratic, too slow. That same year, the Boulder Police Department said they were actively reviewing genetic DNA testing processes and working with state and federal agencies to explore new leads. They acknowledged that technological advances since 1996 could offer new hope. Despite these efforts, no arrests have been made. No suspect has been charged. The official statement remains that the case is open and active, with evidence held under review. Legally, JonBenét Ramsey's murder remains one of the longest-running unsolved child homicide cases in American history. It has redefined how police handle high-profile crimes, how grand juries are influenced by media pressure, and how modern DNA science can exonerate, but not always identify. The tragedy of JonBenét's death is now intertwined with the legal system's limitations. It's a reminder that evidence can clear a name, but not always deliver justice. Almost 3 decades have passed since the morning JonBenét Ramsey was found in her family's Boulder home. Yet the case still breathes. It's a file that refuses to close, a crime frozen in time but constantly re-examined by new technology, new investigators, and new generations of true crime audiences who grew up hearing her name. In recent years, the investigation has shifted almost entirely toward modern forensic science. In 2021, the Boulder Police Department confirmed they were working with federal agencies to explore advanced DNA sequencing and genealogical databases, the same methods that cracked cases once thought unsolvable, like the Golden State Killer. According to official statements, more than 1,500 pieces of evidence have been collected, and nearly 200 DNA samples have been analyzed since 1996. But progress has been slow. John Ramsey, now in his 80s, continues to advocate for independent testing outside the Boulder Police Department. He has argued repeatedly that state bureaucracy is holding the case hostage. In interviews, he said, "We're not asking for a miracle, just for the technology that already exists to be used." In late 2022, the Boulder DA's office announced a collaboration with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation to reevaluate how remaining DNA samples could be processed without depleting what little material is left. That was one of the challenges. In 1996, forensic swabbing wasn't as precise as it is today. Some of the most critical samples were consumed by earlier, less advanced testing. Scientists must now balance the risk of exhausting evidence against the hope of finding a usable profile. In 2023, investigators began discussions with several private forensic laboratories specializing in next-generation sequencing. These labs have had success solving decades-old cold cases through familial matching, linking DNA fragments to relatives found in public databases like GeneMatch or Family Tree. The potential was enormous, but permission to use such databases is tightly regulated, especially when it involves private citizens' genetic data. Meanwhile, the media and public attention to the case never completely disappeared. That same year, CBS, ABC, and several streaming networks released retrospective specials marking the 27th anniversary of JonBenét's death. Netflix followed in late 2024 with Cold Case: Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey?, a docuseries that revisited every major theory and featured new interviews with investigators, journalists, and the Ramsey family. The series reignited public interest, but it also sparked renewed criticism of law enforcement's slow pace. Reporters from the Denver Post and Associated Press revealed that Boulder police had received additional DNA leads as early as 2019 but hadn't submitted them for broader genealogical comparison. Police responded by saying they were proceeding carefully and following FBI protocols to prevent contamination or privacy violations. As the case entered its 29th year, digital forensics and crowdsourced investigation began to play larger roles. Independent researchers, some working through open-source platforms and others through podcasts, started re-examining publicly released files, crime scene photos, ransom note analysis, and police transcripts to identify potential patterns missed in the early days. None of these independent efforts have yielded a definitive suspect, but they've kept pressure on officials to remain transparent. The most striking shift in tone, however, came from within the community of Boulder itself. For decades, the city had been defined by this single tragedy. Local residents, once reluctant to talk about the case, began calling for closure. City officials confirmed in early 2025 that a new task force, composed of state, local, and federal experts, had been quietly re-reviewing evidence for more than a year. The goal? To determine whether any remaining DNA samples could be cross-referenced against national genetic databases using updated algorithms that didn't exist a decade ago. The statement released by Boulder Police read simply, "The murder of JonBenét Ramsey remains an active investigation. New technology offers new hope. We continue to pursue every viable lead." While technology moves forward, the emotional core of the case remains deeply human. Patsy Ramsey, gone since 2006, never saw her name formally cleared while she was alive. Burke Ramsey, now an adult, has largely withdrawn from public life, but his occasional statements continue to insist that his sister's killer was an outsider. John Ramsey, despite his age, continues to attend true crime conferences and advocate for cold case funding across the United States. In 2024, he appeared on Good Morning America, where he said, "JonBenét deserves truth, not mythology. Someone out there knows something, and science will catch up." Experts agree that it could happen. Genetic genealogy has already identified killers decades after their crimes, using a single microscopic trace of DNA. If a reliable profile still exists in the Ramsey evidence vault, the right lab could find a match within days. The obstacle is not science, it's authorization. Beyond the technical hurdles, the JonBenét case has become a cultural mirror reflecting how America processes tragedy. It exposed flaws in forensic protocol, the dangers of media sensationalism, and the lasting scars of public suspicion. It also transformed true crime into mass entertainment, spawning podcasts, documentaries, and online communities that blur the line between investigation and obsession. Today, Boulder still receives weekly inquiries from journalists and private investigators asking for updates. The city's official cold case webpage continues to list JonBenét Ramsey as unsolved, alongside a phone number and email address for tips. 29 years later, the same questions echo: who wrote the ransom note? Who left that fragment of male DNA? And why has justice remained just out of reach? For all the speculation, one truth persists. Every piece of evidence in this case tells a story, but none of them tell the whole one. Somewhere between the contaminated crime scene, the decades of theories, and the advances of modern science, the answer still lies waiting to be found. Until then, JonBenét Ramsey's name continues to stand as both mystery and warning, a symbol of how a single night can unravel an entire system and how time, despite everything, can never erase a question that refuses to die.